The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling plains, casting long shadows across Samuel's small, weather-beaten farm. The wheat in his field swayed gently in the breeze, golden and heavy with the promise of harvest, yet Samuel's heart felt a dull weight as he surveyed the land. He had been tending the fields for years, living a life defined by routine and toil, and though he took pride in his work, he often felt the gnawing ache of solitude. The farm was prosperous enough to sustain him, but the emptiness that lingered in his home, the absence of laughter and companionship, was a constant reminder of what he had never found in life. Today, though, he had a practical purpose: to ride into town and trade a portion of his grain for supplies he could not grow or make himself. He saddled his horse with practiced efficiency, the leather creaking under his hands, and double-checked the saddle bags, ensuring the sacks of grain were securely fastened. The horse, a sturdy chestnut mare with a quiet temperament, shifted under his hands and flicked her ears, sensing the early morning air. Samuel mounted and nudged her forward, the hooves striking the dry earth with a rhythmic clop-clop that echoed across the open plains. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, dotted with clusters of trees and the distant outlines of hills that marked the edge of civilization. Dust rose in lazy swirls as he followed the rutted dirt road, the wind tugging at his hat and cooling the sweat on his brow. Entering the town, he was greeted by the familiar chaos of the market. Merchants called out their wares, children darted between legs with reckless abandon, and townsfolk haggled over prices with sharp voices and sharper eyes. Samuel led his horse to a post outside the general store, tying her with a practiced loop of rope. The town smelled of dust, livestock, and baked bread, a mix that was both comforting and harsh. Adjusting the brim of his hat, he stepped inside, his boots clacking against the worn wooden floor. Behind the counter, a young woman moved with quiet efficiency. Mary, the widow who had taken over her late husband's shop, was arranging goods with careful hands, her brow furrowed slightly as she measured flour into a paper sack. Her movements were precise, graceful, and seemingly effortless, yet there was a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders that hinted at the responsibilities she carried alone. Her hair was tied back neatly, and the faint trace of grief on her face softened her otherwise striking features. Samuel caught sight of her from the doorway, and for a moment, he hesitated, the usual shyness he carried into town amplified by the unexpected flutter in his chest. "Morning," he said quietly, stepping closer to the counter. His voice, roughened by years of labor, sounded oddly foreign to him in this setting. Mary looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of recognition and polite curiosity. "Morning, Samuel," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Here to trade your grain." He nodded, setting the first sack on the counter. "Yes. Got a good harvest this season, thought I'd trade some for supplies." Her hands moved deftly, helping him measure and weigh the grain, and Samuel couldn't help but notice the strength in her fingers, the careful way she handled each sack as if it were both precious and mundane. There was an unspoken rhythm to her movements, a balance of efficiency and grace that he found himself admiring more than he expected. As they worked side by side, the air between them slowly filled with conversation. At first, it was practical, discussions of prices, the quality of the grain, and the scarcity of certain goods, but gradually, the dialogue deepened. Mary asked about his farm, his fields, and the challenges of tending the land through drought and wind. Samuel found himself answering with more detail than necessary, speaking of the rhythms of planting and harvesting, the patience required to coax life from the soil, and the quiet satisfaction that came from watching a field of wheat sway in the breeze. Mary listened intently, her hazel eyes bright and attentive, occasionally offering a thoughtful remark or question. She spoke of her late husband with careful reverence, acknowledging the difficulty of managing the store alone while maintaining hope for the future. Her words were measured but warm, and Samuel felt a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of perseverance and loss that bridged the gap between them. For the first time in years, he felt seen not just as a man with a farm, but as someone who had experienced hardship, someone capable of depth and feeling. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Samuel and Mary exchanged small smiles and subtle gestures, the kind that speak volumes without words. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of the loneliness they both carried, a silent recognition that each had endured life's trials largely alone. Samuel found himself laughing quietly at one of Mary's dry, witty comments, a sound that felt foreign yet comforting in his own ears. Mary's lips curved into a soft smile, the first genuine one he had seen since arriving in town. By the time the last sack of grain had been weighed and stored, the sun had begun its descent, bathing the town in the golden hues of late afternoon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around them. Samuel looked at Mary, her hands resting lightly on the counter, hair slightly mussed from the day's work, and felt a pull in his chest, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and an unfamiliar longing. She had entered his day like a quiet breeze, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Mary's gaze met his for a moment, and he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, something that mirrored his own tentative intrigue. There was no need for words, the shared understanding between them was palpable. Samuel realized he had not just come for grain, nor had Mary merely assisted a customer. Something deeper had shifted, an invisible current had formed between them, strong yet delicate, carrying with it the possibility of connection, of companionship, and perhaps even something resembling hope. As he turned to leave, Samuel felt a sudden hesitation, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had come with a practical purpose, and yet now, he found himself reluctant to go. Thank you for your help today, he said, his voice low, carrying a sincerity that made Mary pause. You're welcome, Samuel, she replied softly. Her tone held an unspoken warmth, a quiet invitation that lingered in the space between them. He mounted his horse slowly, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions he barely understood. The simple act of trading grain had become far more than he had anticipated. As he rode out of town, he glanced back at the small store, at the widow whose quiet strength had left an impression on him that would not fade. The prairie stretched endlessly before him, but the horizon now carried a new weight, a sense of anticipation and possibility. Samuel had come for grain, but he left with something far more valuable, the stirring of a connection that had the power to change his life forever, even if neither of them yet understood how. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the sun had slipped below the hills, leaving behind a sky streaked with purples and golds. The air was cooler now, and the long shadows of the buildings stretched across the dirt road, a visual echo of the impact Mary had already made on his heart. He rode in silence, the rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves matching the erratic beating of his chest. Samuel realized that the simple journey for grain had unexpectedly led him to a crossroads, not of roads and fields, but of life and love, and he knew, deep down, that his future would never be the same after this day. The sun had slipped entirely below the horizon, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the pale silver of an emerging moon. The streets, once bustling with merchants and townsfolk, had quieted, leaving only the occasional creak of a wagon wheel or the distant bark of a dog echoing through the night. Samuel lingered near the general store, unwilling to leave, caught in a strange mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had ridden into town that morning with one simple purpose, to trade grain for supplies, and yet, by evening, his thoughts were entirely consumed by Mary, the widow whose quiet strength and gentle demeanor had unsettled him in the most unexpected way. Mary emerged from the store, brushing the last stray crumbs from the stoop with her broom. Her face bore the faint weariness of a long day's labor, but her eyes shone with an inner resilience that drew Samuel's gaze immediately. She paused when she saw him standing near his horse, the lantern light casting warm highlights across his weathered features. Her breath caught slightly in her chest, as though she had sensed the significance of this encounter before he had even spoken. "You're still here," she said softly, a mixture of surprise and something gentler, curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of anticipation, lingering in her tone. "The day's over. Don't you need to get back to your farm before dark?" Samuel shook his head slowly, a small, unpracticed smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I suppose I should, but I didn't expect to meet anyone worth talking to today." "Seems I miscalculated," he said, the honesty in his voice surprising even him. He shifted slightly, brushing the dust from his coat, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the vulnerability of exposing a piece of his heart to another human being. Mary tilted her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. It was a delicate sound, unguarded and warm, and it made something stir deep within Samuel's chest. "Is that so, and you think you've found me worth the miscalculation?" she asked, her eyes twinkling faintly in the lantern light, betraying her amusement despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "I do," he admitted without hesitation. "I've spent most of my life tending fields, watching the horizon, and thinking there wasn't much more to life than work. But you've shown me there's more. I didn't plan for it, and yet, here I am." His words were careful, deliberate, carrying the weight of sincerity, and Mary felt the pull of their meaning before she fully understood it. She looked down at her hands, momentarily brushing her fingers against the edge of the broom. The simple gesture, mundane yet intimate, grounded her even as her heart began to race. She thought of the months she had spent alone since her husband's passing, the nights filled with quiet reflection and the careful management of the store, wondering if companionship and trust were ever within reach again. And now, here was Samuel, a man she barely knew, yet whose presence had stirred something within her, a fragile hope, a spark of curiosity, a tentative longing. "Samuel, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft rustle of the evening wind. "I've been alone for so long, and I wasn't expecting anyone to notice me, really. But I felt something too, today. Something I thought I'd lost." His gaze softened, and he stepped closer, though he kept a respectful distance, mindful of the fragility in her words and the boundaries that had been shaped by grief and resilience. "Mary," he said slowly, "I don't want to frighten you or rush you. I only ask that you trust me. Not for tomorrow, not for next week, but right now, in this moment. Whatever you're ready for, I'll meet you there." Mary's breath hitched. The simplicity of his statement, free from expectation or pressure, wrapped around her heart like a warm embrace. She had grown accustomed to people treating her as fragile, as someone to be pitied or pitilessly guided, but Samuel's words carried respect, dignity, and a quiet strength that she hadn't realized she needed. Slowly, almost tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The warmth of his palm against hers sent a shiver through her, a confirmation that the connection she felt was real, grounded in honesty and mutual understanding. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, letting the small gesture speak louder than words ever could. The lanterns cast a golden glow over their faces, illuminating the subtle contours of their expressions, the faint blush on Mary's cheeks, the softened eyes of Samuel that held equal measures of longing and respect. The wind whispered across the street, carrying the faint scent of prairie grass and earth, and for both of them, the world outside seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them in this fragile, unspoken bubble of understanding. I want to trust you," Mary admitted finally, her voice trembling slightly. "It's been so long since I've felt safe, since I've let myself believe someone could care without expectation. But I want to try." Samuel's grip on her hand tightened gently, a silent promise of protection and patience. "Then you will," he said softly. "I'll prove it to you, every day. Whatever comes, we face it together." The first stars had begun to appear in the night sky, twinkling faintly above the rooftops of the quiet town. Samuel helped Mary gather a few things from the store that she needed for the night, though neither spoke much, the simple act of being near one another carrying more weight than any conversation could. When they stepped outside, the crisp night air enveloped them, but the warmth from their hands and the bond forming between them offered comfort against the chill. "Samuel," Mary said after a moment, her voice hesitant, Do you really mean what you said? That we could face it together?" "I do," he said firmly, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm not asking for anything I can't give. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this: I want you with me. Not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but because I choose you. Every day, if you'll let me." Mary felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief, hope, and a growing affection she hadn't dared to name. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that companionship, trust, and even love were not beyond her reach. She squeezed his hand lightly, a silent affirmation of her willingness to step into the unknown with him. "Then, I'll come," she whispered, her voice steadying with newfound courage. "I'll come with you, Samuel. Not because I have to, but because I want to." A slow smile spread across Samuel's face, one of genuine joy and relief. He guided her to his horse, helping her climb into the saddle safely, and climbed up beside her with careful movements. The chestnut mare shifted beneath them, sensing the weight and the new energy of the pair, and began a steady trot out of the town. As they rode into the night, the prairie stretched endlessly before them, bathed in silver moonlight and dotted with the glimmer of distant stars. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and grass, and the soft rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves against the dirt became a steady, comforting cadence. Samuel stole a glance at Mary, seated confidently yet cautiously beside him, and realized that the journey they had embarked upon was no longer about grain, supplies, or routine. It was about something infinitely more profound: the beginning of trust, the fragile bloom of love, and the promise of a shared life shaped not by fear or obligation, but by choice and mutual care. And in that quiet, starlit night, as the world stretched endlessly around them, both Samuel and Mary understood that a single day in town, meant only for trade, had transformed their lives forever. The horizon ahead held uncertainty, challenges, and hard work, but for the first time, they faced it together, and the knowledge that they would do so side by side made every shadow of doubt vanish into the vast, open prairie behind them.